The All Black podcast is powered by our official cloud software partner, SAP, helping our teams in black become the best run teams in sport. To listen to this episode and all the All Black podcasts, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere you get your podcasts.
Here we go. Can he make it?
This is the All Blacks podcast.
Kia ora whānau, welcome to the All Black podcast powered by SAP. Today, a look under the hood at the engine of New Zealand Rugby, where memories are made and All Blacks are created. To discuss grassroots footy as former Canterbury and Crusaders player and current General Manager of Community Rugby. Welcome, Steve Lancaster.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be here.
How's things, mate? All well?
Good. Yeah, good. Club rugby's underway. School rugby's about to start, so we're fizzing at the moment.
Happy days. Good. Probably a little bit of weight off the shoulders when the season actually starts, no doubt. Oh, question first up, mate. How does one become the General Manager for New Zealand Rugby of Community?
Yeah, it's probably the hardest question you'll ask me today, I suspect, because I have no idea. Here I am. I think, to answer that, I think first and foremost you have to have a deep care for the game.
Yeah.
And if you don't actually have an intrinsic connection with this game and intrinsic drivers around the game, then this is probably not a role that you're going to find yourself in. Most of my working career has been in professional and high performance rugby, and had some great experiences and great opportunities through that. But what gets me out of bed in the morning really is community rugby. I've had some fantastic experiences, made some fantastic friendships along the way, and I want to see this game continue to provide those opportunities and experiences to New Zealanders for generations to come. So that's what smokes my tyres. That's why I'm here. Been fortunate enough to have played the game to a fairly high level, but right through from school and club grades to Super Rugby level. I've worked in the game in a number of capacities, as I said, professional rugby previously, high performance, taken some time out of the game, and back here where I feel really connected to the game.
Mate, I love it, and no doubt you have many a strong opinion given to you on a day-to-day basis, which is awesome, which is why our game is such a great thing. A few warm-up questions before we get into the guts of the interview and look under the hood. But for you, any first rugby memories really stick out?
Yeah, so I didn't really start playing rugby in earnest till I was about 14 years old at St Peter's College, and trialled for the under-15 open grade and made that. But my earliest rugby memory is actually running around barefoot playing rugby for my primary school. It's a little primary school called Monte Cecilia in Mount Roskill, probably 5 or 6 years old, barefoot on Potters Park. I played for a couple of seasons. I had no idea what I was doing. I think I was running the wrong direction half the time. But as you can see, I'm bigger than most kids, and so I ended up being put up through weight for age grades, and so I stopped playing rugby after a couple of years at primary school because I was just playing with kids that were a lot older than me and wasn't really enjoying that. But came back to it at high school and have never left it.
Mate, and if it looks like a lock and walks like a lock, has it always been a lock? Is that where you always plied your trade?
Sadly, I seem to have always been plonked in that position, but, I'd unashamedly say it's the best and most important position on the field.
Yeah, 100%. I'm sure many would agree with you. Favourite All Black growing up, can you remember?
Yeah, I would say Andy Hayden.
Oh, there we go.
Again, he's a lock.
Yeah, rest in peace, great man.
Yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate enough, actually, when I was in the Auckland Academy out of high school, to be mentored by Andy. So had a personal connection with him as well. But as a kid growing up, watching the All Blacks, watching Auckland play, he was pretty iconic and someone that I aspired to follow.
100%, mate. I thought you were a red and black through and through Crusaders man, but you're Auckland Academy and talking about things up and around this neck of the woods. What's going on there? What got you down to Canterbury then?
Yeah, I've got a foot in both islands, it's fair to say. So born and raised Aucklander, came up through the grades here in Auckland, and played one game for Auckland back in 91, I think it was, or 92, maybe 92. Yeah. That was back in the days of Super 10, when reserves were genuinely reserves and didn't take the field unless there was an injury. So I spent a whole season on the bench for Auckland and had one appearance. But then I was fortunate enough in my mid-20s to have an opportunity or be presented with an opportunity with Canterbury and the Crusaders at the advent of Super Rugby. Moved down there and had timed my run really well in terms of moving to Canterbury. So we had some great success, part of some great teams. Started a family down there, raised a family down there. through circumstance, find myself living back in Auckland now and genuinely love both cities. So I have a real dilemma a couple of times a season when that game comes around.
Well played, sat on the fence extremely well there. Most memorable game and why? Can you remember some absolute crackers?
Yeah, look, again, a lot of memorable games. I think I've been one of the luckiest people in rugby in terms of some of the teams I've played on and people I've played with. So have been fortunate enough to be involved in some pretty special games. But for me, my most memorable rugby game is actually not one that I played in. This is Christchurch Park, probably about 15 years ago, watching my son play under 6th grade, first year rugby, Ripper, scoring his first try against Sumner. Yeah. And that's actually my most cherished rugby memory.
Yeah, happy days. Yeah, I love that. And I'm sure there's been some crackers in your career as well. Toughest player you've ever marked and why? She's the engine room that you used to deal in, the dark arts, particularly perhaps back in the early days when there weren't as many television cameras going around, were there some tough nuts to crack and who leaves a memory on you?
Yeah, again, I think I was fortunate that I was on the same side as some of the toughest players to mark and benefited from their protection as a young fella. But for me, I would say Mark Andrews. Natal Sharks and Springbok.
Yeah. Absolute super legend in the early days, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. And you talk about the dark arts, and he was a hard man. He was technically really good, really tough to mark in the line out.
Great athlete, eh? He was a huge, fit, big athletic
man.
Guy.
Yep, and just tough.
Yeah.
You knew you were marking a tough man when you played Mark Andrews.
Mate, how good. Any coaches, most influential coach, and perhaps why I know by the sounds of it, great mentoring from Andy Hayden, who was an absolute technician in his position. But is there some coaches that really stick out and maybe some characteristics that go with that?
Yep. Again, a number of coaches that have left their mark on me and I guess probably played a role in me still being in the game now and involved in giving back through my role. But I'll give you two. So the first one is a guy who's no longer with us, Eric Kalassi. He was an iconic coach at Auckland Marist back in the 90s. Led Auckland Marist to a couple of Gallagher Shield successes, which was a huge deal for the club. And I think any players that came through the club in that period, and a number of them went on to be great All Blacks, but they would probably all cite Eric as someone that was a really influential coach in their careers. And then I frankly can't go past Wayne Smith. Was lucky enough to be coached by Smithy at the Crusaders, and it's Smithy. I don't have to say much more than that, really.
Totally. Smithy's actually our next podcast, and
cool.
I'm struggling to condense it into 1 hour. There's just so many things I want to chat to him about, and he's just such a great sharer as well, isn't he? He has a great philosophy around sharing knowledge and just making sure that he can help as many people as possible. So I'm enjoying that, but. Mate, you hinted on there a little bit. Auckland Marist, no doubt you keep an eye on their results, and there's been some fantastic players come through that club. I think JK and Fitzy and these sort of guys, wasn't it? But we've started club rugby. We're 2 or 3 weeks in different parts of the country. What are we looking like? How are the numbers? Is it? Are we off to a good start? Like, you're someone who keeps their finger right on the pulse of our community game. What's it looking like so far? A couple of weeks in.
We're off to a good start. We don't wash up all the registration data and team numbers until towards the end of the season, but at this stage we're tracking really positively. Certainly compared with last year, numbers are significantly up on last year. Of course, we've had a couple of years of COVID, so for us the real benchmark is 2019, which was our first season prior to COVID. On the boys and men's game, we're tracking comparably to 2019, so thereabouts. May end up a little bit up, a little bit down, but sort of comparable, which is good because that was a good year. And our women's and girls' numbers are through the roof. We've been tracking consistently from the beginning of registrations at approximately double where they were last year, and we're forecasting those numbers to be significantly up on 2019.
Mate, that's awesome. And is there anything particular that's driving that? Obviously, like you say, post-COVID now, and we've got a full runway at it, and we can get back connected with our clubs and our people and come together again. But is there anything in particular you think has driven that, or it's actually just a lot of the uncertainty has been taken away around the things that we're able to commit to now?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the women's and girls game, World Cup clearly had an impact, and that's helped a lot. But also, our system is much more aware of the opportunity with women's and girls participation, and also the demand for it. So we're seeing clubs standing up girls teams and women's teams where they haven't before. We're seeing provincial unions who are initiating girls-only grades at teenage level, and new and expanded women's grades. So system readiness, along with a massively positive exposure at the end of last year, and the fantastic role modelling that came out of that World Cup campaign, has helped a lot on the women's and girls' side. On the men's side, I think it's just a return to normality. You know, we haven't got that uncertainty around COVID. Last year we were dealing with gathering limits and COVID vaccination certificates. All that's gone, and so people could just get back to, okay, this is what a normal year looks like, and a normal year for me looks like playing rugby.
Yeah, 100%. Does that flow through our schools as well? Like, I know you guys aren't as heavily involved in schools rugby, but still no doubt have a good sense of what's going on there. How's that looking as well?
Yeah, tracking pretty well. It's harder to give you a real steer on where school numbers are at, because school grades most of them haven't started yet.
Yeah, that's right.
And so the registration data tends to flow in a little bit later. But anecdotally, what we're hearing is that, again, similar levels to 2019 in terms of numbers. 2019 was the first year in several years that we actually reported an increase year on year in boys' numbers, teenage boys. So some of the stuff that we were doing pre-COVID to address declining participation, we think was starting to work.
Yep.
Again, we've had 3 years of disruption, so this year we sort of pick up where we left off, hopefully.
Yeah, nice. Mate, Silverlake, that deal's now done. A lot of media around that last year, but one of the results is that is an investment into the grassroots game. I think $7.5 million. But what does that look like, and perhaps how are clubs using that? Is there any examples of where you think the Silverlake investment is starting to come through into our club game, and hopefully, like you say, things around maintaining our numbers, providing a great experience for people down at our clubs? Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah. So in terms of that $7.5 million that was invested directly into the club network, the majority of that investment has gone into facilities, whatever that looks like. But for a lot of clubs, they simply weren't or aren't equipped to cater to teams populated with women and girls. So, having urinals as opposed to toilet cubicles, shower cubicles versus mass showers. So there's been a lot of investment into club facilities to make them more welcoming for women and girls. And then, outside of that 7.5, there's been a lot of investment that's flowed into the game through provincial unions, through ourselves as well, that we've been able to apply to things like our Girls Activator program. So we've got 14 of those around the country, giving girls a first exposure to rugby. Started that last year, we'll continue that this year, and we're projecting 150,000 girls will have a rugby experience through that program this year. So that's a direct benefit.
Mate, that's awesome. And it's early days in many respects, particularly for the Silverlake partnership. It's really early days. So much of that is to flow through the rugby union and into our community over time. But also we are post-COVID. What are some of the things you'd love to see happen in club rugby? What are some of the things that you're really promoting to our clubs and schools, to try and utilise that investment, but also to maintain numbers and give a great experience?
Yeah, probably two areas. The first is facilities, which I've spoken to. So we've been really fortunate the last 2 years. We've had Bunnings as a partner for our national championships across all competitions. Bunnings have their club grant scheme, and so for 2 years now I've been privy to all of those applications from across our club network. And it's fair to say that club facilities can do with some investment across the country. The Bunnings program has just been magnificent, and that $30,000 investment into last year it was into 10 clubs. That makes a real difference. But man, if we could replicate that across 50 or 100 clubs, that would be great. The other area that I think would really benefit from increased investment is the volunteer aspect of clubs, so club administration and running clubs, right? Like, it's just increasingly challenging for clubs, not just rugby clubs, but sports clubs in general, to find volunteers with the time and the capacity to run a club or to run teams. So any investment that can help in that regard will go a long way. And we are seeing some of our provincial unions starting to invest more in that side of the game around club health as well, which is really positive.
Mate, that's awesome. There's always discussion around player safety and different rules and trials to try and make sure that the game, while dynamic and really tough, is safe. And you've done a number of things in club rugby this year, particularly around tackle height is probably the main one. Firstly, what drove that? And secondly, we are 1, 2 and 3 weeks into the club season. I went down and watched my local rugby club on Saturday, which are playing under some of the new rules. What does it look like? How's it going?
Yeah, again, we think it's going pretty well. At this stage, it's largely anecdotal feedback, and probably a bit mixed around the country, depending on which game you watch, as to how well it's being applied or implemented. But by and large, Our sense is that people, players and referees and coaches have adapted to it really well. We're not getting blowback that people aren't liking. I think one of the key things with regard to that is that we trialled it last year in limited grades. We then engaged with people that played under that law variation. They liked it. They thought it felt safer to play with a lower tackle height. They also felt that the game was more enjoyable. It flowed better. So we were able to anchor this year's innovation across all community grades on participant feedback rather than just NZR, from a glass tower, adjudicating on something. So it's landed pretty well.
So what is the exact tackle variation? Is it I might be under the nipple line, or like what is the exact so that when we're down watching the local club we know what we're looking at?
Yep.
What's the rule?
So the tackle first tackler must tackle below the sternum, which is slightly below the nipple line for those that aren't that au fait with human anatomy, right?
Sure.
So just a little bit lower than the nipple line. The second tackler or any subsequent tackler, still the existing law applies in terms of tackling below the shoulder. And so what we want to avoid was a situation where both tacklers are going in at the sternum and we create a risk or an opportunity for head-on-head collisions. So that's why we've left any second or subsequent tackler at the shoulder or below.
Yeah, cool. And so you're saying trialled a little bit last year, feedback was good, and so now it applies to all club rugby and all school rugby, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, all community grades. It's a trial again for this year, so again, we're really committed to engaging with our participants. Right, look, we only make these changes to make the game safer and more enjoyable to play.
Yeah.
So if we get feedback or our observations through assessment of the trial is that it's not achieving one or both of those things, then we may not continue with it. But I have to say, intrinsically and intuitively, it feels right, and the initial feedback we're getting from participants is that it's working, so I think it's here to stay.
Yeah, I must admit, I went down and watched Puna play the Mount on Saturday, and even though I knew the rule, I actually didn't even think about it till about 30 or 40 minutes in, and I didn't actually notice it. Yeah, it was a good game. It was nice and open. Perhaps there were more offloads, I'm not too sure, but it's also April and the ground's firm, and always see probably quite a good style at that time of year. And the score was 20-6, so it wasn't, necessarily, it was still just a good game of footy, I thought. So certainly wasn't causing a lot of discussion down where I was watching on Saturday. What's I know, perhaps in France, I know directives from World Rugby, recommendations, etc. They'd like to go a little bit further, but are we just dipping our toes in the water? We do something, we get a bit of feedback, and we go from there.
Yeah, to a degree. So one thing I'll say, or the first thing I'll say is we're not done with these law innovations, right? So we think that this is a good approach to the game, is to try things, and then if they work, we'll bake them in. If they don't, we'll go back to where they were. We'll try something different. As you say, the French for a number of years now have been playing with all tackles below the waist at community level, and the English, the RFU, have just announced that at the end of last year for this season. Our assessment was that below the sternum is the right level. As you said, when you watch a game, you don't notice a huge difference, right? And yet what it's done is it's lowered the upper limit by about 6 or 8 inches, and that just removes that risk, right, of head on shoulder or head on head contact between the tackler and the ball carrier, without massively changing the way the game is played. Interestingly, World Rugby have had a look at all of the trials that are in play, the French initiative, ours in particular, a couple of others around the world, and where they are landing is that that below the sternum is probably the appropriate upper limit. So that's a nice validation, actually, of our work.
Totally, and I think quite often you hear, people hear these rules and they say, you can still get knocked out on your hip, or you still get knocked out on your knees. But actually, I'm told, because maybe I've said those sort of things over the years, Steve, who knows? But it's actually the majority of concussions are head on head or high shoulder on head or those higher points of contact, aren't they?
Yep, that's where the majority of concussions happen. And look, we're realistic here, right? Like we want to take all possible steps to remove risk from the game.
Yeah.
But short of removing all contact from the game, we will never remove all risk. So it's a fine line for us between preserving the traits and attributes of the game, and we're firm believers in the benefits that participation in sport, and in particular participation in rugby, offers over the risks. But we're really cognizant of the risks, and we'll continue to invest a lot of time and effort in mitigating those risks.
So what's the process around, we're a few weeks in, and you and your team going to get out and watch a bit of stuff and get a bit of feedback from all the people participating in it. School rugby starts after Easter, and see where we stand.
Yep, exactly. Not just myself and my team going and standing on the sidelines. We've got a more robust approach to evaluating and assessing it as well. So
that's good to hear.
Yeah, so we're videoing games. We'll be formally surveying and engaging in focus groups. So as I say, it's not just Steve Lancaster and his cronies watching games and making decisions, but we'll talk to the participants.
Well, that's a good thing about footy these days, though. Pretty much everything's online, isn't it? Almost every game of club rugby and all sorts, so there'll be a huge amount of information you can take in. You talked about it a little bit earlier, but like off the back of last year, everyone's got a Women's World Cup rugby story. I got heaps, like from going to games and being blown away to, hearing stories from Smithy and the things that they did, stories from the girls. We had the girls down the bay, plenty at Ripper Rugby, taking photos with my boys and my little girl, Teresa Fitzpatrick and Portia all down. So it was awesome, and we've also recently got a strategy and investment into the women's game. Are we seeing, and you sort of hinted it a little bit earlier, off the back of that tournament and the whole, if you can see it, you can be it stuff, is there an uptick in girls participating, tangible stuff that's happened off the back of that tournament?
Yeah, so there's definitely a tangible uptick in participation. So as I said, I think I said earlier, we're tracking about double last year's registrations. But it's bigger than that, right? It's about what this game has done to the national psyche and awareness of the game, and that the game is a game for all. It's interesting, I see this on the screen behind you, the All Blacks podcast, and they're all Blacks. Not surprisingly, given it's the All Blacks podcast. But as you've just mentioned with your kids as well, right? Like the World Cup and the Black Ferns last year have introduced a whole bunch of rugby role models that probably didn't exist, or certainly not to the same degree before last year. So that's a real positive. Over half the people that attended World Cup fixtures last year were attending a rugby game for the first time. So that's opened up an entirely new market.
It's the first full game of rugby my wife's ever watched,
there you go.
I think, to be honest. And I love rugby. My boys love rugby. I make her watch way too much rugby, but invariably she's either out of the room or on her phone or whatever it may be, but with other members of the family in the final. Well, I was at the semi-final, which was unreal, but for the final we all sat down and watched the whole thing. So that's I suppose that's a testament to the success of it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't buy that drama either, right? Which helps a lot. But so participation's been great. Role models, just awareness has been fantastic. But within NZR and within our system, we've just, in the last 2 weeks, launched our women's and girls strategy. So we've got a much more focused and deliberate approach to growing the game for women and girls. And that's not just in a playing capacity, but it's actually women in rugby, right? Growing the number of, and again, you've seen some of the media coverage around the Black Ferns coaching appointments. We want to see female coaches of female teams going forward, and male teams for that matter. It takes time to grow them, but the strategy paints the pathway for us to do that. And underpinning the strategy is significant investment in women's and girls rugby. So $22 million next year budgeted within NZR for growing the women's and girls game. We've got 6 new roles within NZR alone. We've got new programs that we're standing up. So there's a bit of substance behind the rhetoric as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Watch the space. How good. Look, there's always conversation around participation, particularly at the junior level. Mum won't let their boys play rugby anymore. All the different things that kids can do these days. My son's school holidays, he's out there now, probably watching NBA or something, whatever it is. Don't worry, Steve, he's playing footy in a couple of weeks as well. But the point being, super competitive out there. Maybe there's more things to do than when you and me were young. What are we doing? What are we doing at that entry level when kids first come into contact with the game? What are we doing first to get them into the game? And secondly, I suppose, to hang on to them so that they become, lifetime members of the New Zealand rugby community.
Yeah, so it's a really valid reflection on society as a whole, right? The world's changing. Yeah. Kids have more options. People have less disposable time, more disposable income. So the world's changing. And as the CEO of one of our provincial unions said to me just yesterday, actually, used to be okay to smoke at work. Yeah, it's not now. Yeah. So why should rugby look exactly the same as it did when people could go to work and pull out a cigarette? Of course it shouldn't, right? Rugby has to change. So in a nutshell, we are changing. We're not trying to fundamentally change the game, but we recognise that the game needs to be participant-centred, and while that's jargon, really what that means is understand what people are looking for in the game and then give them that, rather than expecting them to mould themselves to what the game thinks they should look like or how they should fit in. So things like more smaller-sided playing opportunities, 10-a-side, 7-a-side, keeping junior players in smaller-sided forms for longer, right? So there's there's a mindset amongst some people that kids need to progress to 15-a-side as quickly as possible, specialise as early as possible. What we know from research and data is that actually that's not the case. Kids benefit from playing a wide range of sports for as long as possible, playing as many positions as possible for as long as possible, having as many touches, making as many tackles. So giving the kids what they want in the game. At teenage level, we are investing heavily in promoting more events in the tournament weeks. Secondary schools have summer tournament week, winter tournament week. Rugby was largely MIA up until a couple of years ago in terms of those tournament weeks. Right. We now have, this year we're forecasting to have about 8,500 teenagers playing rugby in the 2 tournament weeks. So we're gearing up in that space again, just meeting demand.
Yeah, because that's things. Because it's... you did right. There's people, we all so often, what we think our kids want is driven by parents or driven by coaches, but actually it's providing a good experience for the kids, isn't it? Is there, I know with a lot of stuff as well, we've taken, or in some areas, rep rugby's coming on later on in life and all that sort of stuff. And I think the old traditional stalwart rugby supporter on the leaner at the club would say, well, that's not preparing All Blacks anymore, and we need to get them into positions, and they need to learn to win and lose. They need to do all this sort of stuff. But actually, is that stopping our ability to prepare All Blacks and Black Ferns or not?
No, absolutely not, right? And so you're right, some of those traditional mindsets around how rugby has looked for the last 30, 50, 100 years still prevail. It doesn't fit with the modern context, right? So in the teenage space, we've got this phenomenon of teenage drop-off, particularly with teenage boys.
It's particularly bad at sort of year 11, isn't it? Or
yes.
10, 11, 12.
Yeah,
once they come into high school, they get involved, and then perhaps after a couple of years they drop away.
That's right. So no surprises there. At around age 15, which is around the point where young boys in particular will realise whether or not they're in line to make the first 15. They'll make some decisions around their continued participation. Or maybe their school doesn't even offer rugby, right, because it doesn't have the resource or the capacity. So... to address that drop-off area, we need to mould the game a bit more and be more flexible in how we deliver it. One of the things that the review we undertook at secondary school rugby back in 2019 told us is that performance rugby in secondary schools casts a really long shadow,
right.
and that shadow is diminishing the experience for those that aren't in that performance frame. So we want to see the game meet the needs of all kids that want to play, and for us, I guess if we talked about nirvana for us, it would be that every kid that wants to play rugby can play rugby, right? That no one gets turned away. To do that, we have to change how we offer it a little bit, right? It might not be 15-a-side. It might not be a full winter season. It might be a later start date so they can finish their summer sports and then...
And is that challenging the norm a little bit around rugby has to be played on a Saturday or rugby has to be played on a certain size field by a certain amount of people, a certain shape goes in a certain position? Like we actually have to encourage our PUs in our schools and our areas to actually potentially look at that a bit differently, because even though you set the tone, they deliver it, don't they? Yep,
that's right. We don't control that. We influence it. There are things we control through regulations and policy, but really what we would like to think we do, and we encourage all of our stakeholders to do, is just listen to the participants, right? So they engage them, understand what they're looking for, and then meet that.
Yeah, totally. And I think so often an experience is determined just from my own personal experiences taking my boys' team, that if you turn up to a club that is organised and the fields are marked out and everyone knows what's going on and you know where you're going and people are there with a smile on your face, like you say, the amazing volunteers that are out there, that's 60-70% of the battle done, isn't it? And actually what happens between the white lines is just to make sure they have a bit of fun.
Yep, give them a great experience, right? And one thing I probably should clarify and want to clarify is all of this is not anti-competitiveness, it's not anti-competition, it's not anti-high performance, right? Though there's a really important place for high performance and for pathways in rugby. Rugby is a competitive sport, right? So irrespective of the number of players on the field or what law variations you're playing under, it's a competitive endeavour. Someone's
human
trying
nature
to win.
A bit in rugby, isn't it? Like you try and provide, I say to the boys, go out and have fun, but being young boys that just go out there and still try and rip in and win the game, it's just in their nature.
Absolutely right. So don't take any of the the experimentation or the innovation we're doing as being anti-competition or anti-progression to higher levels. But what we do now know, and this is particularly valid in our women's and girls participants, is that a lot of our participants don't have that aspiration, right? So there's an assumption that everyone that plays the game wants to go as high as they can.
Yeah.
And for some, that's absolutely true, and we need to meet that aspiration. But for others, they're really happy just having a run around with their mates.
Their mates.
Yep.
Yeah, 100%. There's, I wanted to ask, and you sort of touched on it a little bit already, but like New Zealand Rugby isn't as involved in school rugby as perhaps it is in other parts of the community. But I know over time you're starting to build conversations and relationships with a lot of those schools and those various competitions. What would you like to see from New Zealand Rugby perspective in schools? Because I know, absolutely the desire is not to take over and run the shop, so to speak, but it's to, because effectively, I think anyway, schools is the largest cohort of rugby clubs in the whole country, like with the highest participation, the biggest numbers, and they're there on site, and it's a great opportunity to show them a great game,
Yep. Yeah, look, it's a really challenging space, secondary school rugby. And again, the first thing I want to say is we're big believers in secondary school rugby. We think schools should deliver rugby.
Yep.
And importantly, we know that kids like to represent their school, right? Given a choice, they want to put on their school colours. That's their tribe for those 5 years that they're at high school. So that's really important. But we have a different relationship with schools to what we have with clubs because they're not our members by and large.
Yes.
Right? So we don't have that membership based relationship, which means that they're a little bit more autonomous in how they deliver the game. But in saying that, it's a very symbiotic relationship, right? So and when I say we, I mean provincial unions rather than NZR. We provide the referees, we provide the draws, we provide the rules and the construct for the game. Schools provide the grounds, they provide the players, the coaches, right? So neither exists without the other. What we would like to see is a stronger, more integrated relationship between NZR, probably or more than likely through the provincial unions rather than NZR directly, with the schools, with the school network, right? So that there can be genuine engagement on that participant-centred approach that I talked about. How rugby is delivered, what grades kids are really looking for. We've got rugby, interests at our heart. So of course we want to see as many kids as possible playing rugby.
Totally.
Now rugby's just another sport for most schools, right? And they have a whole range of sports on offer. And actually they exist there to provide an education for kids, right? So we know that unless rugby's contributing to the school environment, to the education experience, then it's probably not adding value to the school. So we want to work with schools on, okay, how do we ensure that all the benefits that rugby brings are adding value to the school environment? But as I said, there's probably two cohorts of schools right at the present. There's the big rugby schools, and some of them are doing a great job of fostering rugby at all levels, but for some of them that performance shadow is really having a detrimental impact on kids that don't see themselves within that performance framework. And then there are schools that are just ambivalent, right? It's just rugby's not important. We don't really care if we have it or not. And so we'd like to engage with all of those schools around how can we help. How can we help ensure that rugby is adding value into the school environment and as many kids as possible have the opportunity to play?
Yeah, totally. Mate, I want to finish on the last question around something you touched on again as well, but perhaps the most important element to it all is the people who help deliver it, the coaches, the volunteers, the referees, etc. Is there things that are in the irons in the fire, things that already happened to try and ensure that we keep those numbers and look after them and reward them? Because sometimes I do look at other sports. It is so often the success of a club or even a school, to be honest, as well, is the result of 2 or 3 volunteers who are just doing so much, and there's only so much they can probably really do. It's the same with coaches, it's the same with referees sometimes, and all sorts of different volunteers, no matter what they do. I look at other sports sometimes and I see things like, golf clubs do have manager courses, like there is things like around club managers, and there's actually a bit of a pathway and there's a way to do it, and you go through and sometimes you go to the States and learn off other ones, and then you go up to a bigger club, etc., etc. I'm just wondering if that sort of stuff's on our radar, because I often think, I look at my own area in the Bay of Plenty and there's some clubs that are thriving and there's reasons for that around the resource that they have, but then I look at other clubs that actually one really, really good manager could almost run 2 or 3 clubs, or, it could run a number of sports which rugby is a part of. I just wonder sometimes, is that the sort of stuff we think about? Because, to the point we both made earlier, the experience is not just what happens on the field, it's any number of things before the whistle's even blowing,
Yeah. So our catch
that's
cry.
My pitch. Those are my ideas.
Yeah, no, I get it. And look, our catch cry within community rugby is, we believe in rugby at the heart of our communities, and communities at the heart of rugby, right? And so if people feel part of a community, they're probably likely to stay a part of that community. How do people feel valued? I don't think I'm certain the answer isn't about paying every club volunteer.
Yeah.
But you talk about clubs that are in the Bay that are thriving and those that are not. I would hazard a guess that those that are thriving probably have a paid employee or more than one. Not every club can afford to have a paid employee. So a number of unions this year are piloting different programs, and there's a range of different approaches around club admin support provided by the provincial union. It might be that they're servicing 2 or 3 clubs or supporting 2 or 3 clubs. Here in Auckland, I know Auckland Rugby are doing that. Northland Rugby Union up north of us, similarly, different approach, but similar philosophy around helping clubs to be more self-sustainable through a little bit of admin support. We're fortunate enough to have the support of Sport NZ at the moment. We're undertaking a 2-year review, which we loosely term the Club of the Future review. Sounds a bit futuristic, but really the brief for that review is how do we ensure that the club network is thriving and adding value into its communities for another 25 years, right? And so understanding what that looks like, as you said, it might be club manager programs, it might be a range of web-based content or resources that we can provide. All of that's on the table. That review runs through to the end of this year, but we're already starting to dip a toe in the water around some of those sort of initiatives around club support, club admin. But ultimately making people feel value, because you're right, and you see it time and again, and particularly in schools, right, where 1 or 2 committed people drive a really successful program, the person leaves and the program falls over, right? Totally. So it's about building sustainability.
Mate, no doubt you have colleagues all around the world who try and solve all these issues, and there's parts of the game that are thriving and there are parts that we always need to work on. How do we stack up against, the community game around the world? Because, here we just see this stuff in front of our nose. We see France doing well. We see Ireland doing well. We hear a bit of murmurs around what's going on in England. We see a lot of what's going on in Aussie, and perception is a little bit perhaps that their playing numbers are dropping and they've got some challenges and all that sort of stuff. How do we stack up, in the community space compared to some of our, nations that we play against at the international level?
Community rugby is in really good heart in New Zealand, and I say that with reference to community rugby around the world, not just here in New Zealand. We do often dwell on issues, right? There's less volunteers and it's harder for clubs to run, and there's declining, teenage participation, which, by the way, is not a new phenomenon, right? And it's not a rugby-only phenomenon, but actually, rugby's in really good heart. We've got 450 clubs we've got, or in excess of. We've got over 250 schools playing rugby. Our numbers are healthy, so there's a lot that's really good. But one of the good things about benchmarking internationally is that while at Test match level, nations will compete and they won't share. At community rugby level, we're not competing with each other, and so we try and leverage off each other. So I connect with my counterparts around the world a couple of times a year. We share things, right? So Game On, which we introduced a couple of years ago into community rugby, copied with pride from the RFU.
And what's the elements to that, Game On?
So Game On is if, the best example probably is if a team turns up on match day and they haven't got enough front rowers to play contestable scrums, just go uncontestable. But you're still playing for points, right? So you don't, rather than the worst thing I've seen is turning up to a club ground and seeing players with their bags still in their cars and saying, game was cancelled, we didn't have a front row, or we didn't have enough numbers. So it's about enabling the game to happen irrespective of numbers, irrespective of positional specialisation and those sort of things.
I love that. And we've got to tell our stories, don't we? Because as I said when we're off here, my Saturday is turning up, at Blake Park to take my kids' team, and there's literally 2,000 or 3,000 people playing rugby. Then I go over and do some stuff at TBC where they've got 350 rugby players and a bunch of people who absolutely love it. Then I go down and watch the Puna senior team who's had growth in their senior club as well. So we are getting it right in a number of ways. My last question for you, mate, is, you didn't talk about it too much, but you had a pretty successful playing career. There's Mertz and Norm Maxwell and the Majors. There's all sorts of great names that you played with. Is there anyone that you, or up here actually at Auckland Maris, is there anyone that you get on the leaner with on a Saturday and catch up and reflect and tell war stories, because that's also... That's that intangible stuff. The reason I'm involved in the game, the reason I love it, the reason I love having a chat like this and even the stuff we're saying off camera as well. That's what I love. I love taking the kids in the morning and then heading off to my local rugby club in the afternoon and watching the senior team and solving all the All Black problems, solving all your problems, Steve, all in that one afternoon, and then going back home and rinsing and repeating. That's the stuff I love. That's where I connect, and I don't just talk rugby. I talk of all sorts of things with my mates. Do you do that? Who do you do that with, mate?
Yeah, I do, and I'm really fortunate, right? And I get to work in a sport that I love, and so going down to the club on a Saturday afternoon, I might tell my wife it's work, it's not. It's
might attend. I've used a couple of times, Steve. Yeah,
exactly. So no, look, I mean that through my time at Canterbury and the Crusaders, I mean that playing group are pretty much dispersed globally, so it's not as easy to connect on a Saturday afternoon, and a number are still heavily involved in professional rugby and otherwise engaged. But Auckland Marist is my club. I get down to the club as often as I can. I stood behind the goalpost with John Akarangi, who's head coach of Marist this year, former Crusaders teammate and schoolmate actually. So had a good natter with John. Unfortunately, couldn't influence the result, which was a bit of a shame. Kevin Neepier is another good Marist man that I played with at the Crusaders. Missed a call from Neeps yesterday actually, so if you're listening, mate, I will call you back. Yeah. But it's good to connect with old mates, that's for sure.
Oh, mate, how good. And I think that's a special thing about New Zealand Rugby. A great point to finish on is that throughout our whole club game, junior through to senior, there is an absolute plethora of former professional rugby players giving back, isn't it? For no money, for no reason in particular, just taking their kids or supporting their local club. It is an absolutely essential element to why our game is so successful.
Yep.
Mate, thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate it. I hope the rest of the club season goes really well. Really look forward to seeing some of those initiatives come into action around the club scene. Cheers, mate. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it too. Cheers.
The All Blacks podcast is powered by our official cloud software partner, SAP, helping our teams in black be the best run in sports. Hosted by Rob Dunne in the Hargrave Street studio. Produced by Carl Thompson from Blue and Ginge, the podcast producers. Video editing by Mac Leesburg, graphics by Western Design, content advising from Andy Burt, and commercial manager for the podcast is Valeska Hoth. Follow the All Blacks podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere you get your podcasts.